Well, let's look now at how key identity markers such as race, gender, age, and other factors have shaped Australia's immigration policy. First of all, at the heart of Australia's immigration policy lies the notion of exclusion. And of course, race had been one of the key debates in how Australian immigration policy have operated over time. So the earliest federal government had established what was known as the Post and Telegraph Act of 1901. And Section 15 of this act required ships carrying Australian mail to only use white workers. So, this Immigration Act also restricted all non-white and even to some extent non-British migrants to Australia. And this established also a dictation test so that people who were to migrate to Australia had to perform a dictation in a European language. And out of that dictation, then a decision was to be made whether they were competent to come to Australia or not. So another key debate was around the White Australia policy, which again was a very racist policy, really trying to make sure that we have only white people living in Australia, and again, too much excluding those who were not white from migrating to Australia. So you see this being somehow recognized and even argued for by our first Prime Minister, Sir Edmund Barton, who clearly declared that democratic principles of equality did not extend to race. He clearly said that I do not think either that the doctrine of the equality of man was really ever indeed to include racial equality. There is no racial equality. There is that basic inequality. These races are in comparison with white races. I think no one wants convincing of this fact unequal and inferior. Really extreme, again, extreme declaration from our first prime minister, um, and clearly really racist again. And you can see how these early thinking had, to some extent, shaped the migration policies and some of the things we still live with today. So then came World War II and post-World War II in particular, the entire world was shaped in a certain way. And one of the key concerns around Australia was the fertility rate, which dropped below replacement rate in the 1930s. And in after 1945, actually, following the Second World War, Australia was already, to some extent, also devastated like any other country which was affected by the war. And then came a policy known as populate or perish, trying to focus on how can we get as many people coming to Australia? How can we get many people, making sure that, the country gets as many people as possible so that we don't keep losing people or just everyone, not having exactly the same amount of population we wanted. So, and again, this didn't mean really opening up to everyone. It only included mostly, again, British migration, people migrating from Great Britain. And to some extent, it ended up being opened to refugees from Europe. Um, to some extent, this is what the populate or perish policy was all about post World War II. Then in the 1950s and 60s came assimilation policies, strong assimilation policies, which again also were simpler system of entry permits, somehow abolished at least the dictation test, and these mainly focused on assimilations. And we know a lot about, the assimilation policies and how Indigenous Australians have been treated during that time period, and all non-white people in particular migrating to Australia were considered the same. And in a sense, this had failed to recognize the importance of culture, language, and religion. And the assumption was that people coming or migrating to Australia should adapt to the Australian system. And they should speak the Australian language, which is English. They should adapt to the culture and try as much as feasible to forget their own cultures of origin. And this simply, many observers think it had failed and never produced any better outcomes. Then in the mid 1960s came many kind of integration policies. So the point was here to call for wider migration policies, argument for immigration not based on skin color, push to allow immigration from Asia and to some extent other parts of the world. So the policy shift to integration came in these years to acknowledge that immigrant kinship and community networks could act as bridge between cultures rather than just, keep treating people based on race. So in a sense, you see in the first few years, first few decades following Australia's federation, technically the debate around immigration has been mostly around color, skin color, and race and racism, particularly informing the debates. Then came the 1970s, where there has been a little bit of multiculturalism. The White Australia policy was formally abolished by the Whitlam government in 1972. Racial Discrimination Act was adopted, and to some extent that tried to combat racism in the way my immigration policy was operating. And of course, my multiculturalism became official policy under Fraser government. So a quick example here is how Australia got to accept 200,000 refugees from Southeast Asia following the war in Vietnam. So again, clearly this indicates how we started opening up the immigration system, and many people could start coming to the country. And then from the 1980s to 1990s, there had been an expansion of these efforts, strong efforts to place multiculturalism within the national curriculum. Cultural diversity and tolerance became part of Australian identity, and there had been some efforts to strengthen relationship between ethnic communities and governments, but critiques persisted concerned with preserving constructions of Australian nationhood and culture. But also important in these years had been the adoption of mandatory detention for all people arriving without a valid visa, for that asylum seeker, in the 1992 under Keating government. Howard government, which followed later, kind of emphasized this again in many ways. saying in particular that we will decide who comes to us, to this country and the circumstances in which they come. Then in the 2000 early 2000s, with the government of the Howard's government, these policies around mandatory detention were again strengthened. We had in the media issues around the Tampa and the children overboard affairs. The Tampas are these children from Afghanistan mostly who were coming and wanted to join Australia, but then couldn't and were saved by Norway. And there had been diplomatic concerns between Australia and Norway because of this affair. And then the children overboard was these allegations made actually by the then Australian government that some parents were coming and throwing their were some parents wanted to migrate to Australia were throwing their children in the water, so that they could attract the pity of the Australian government and being allowed in the country. And again, after investigations, all these allegations were found to be false. Um, so clearly, you can see how tighter and stricter the immigration policies had become under Howard's government, which was actually a conservative government, and how mandatory detention of asylum seekers had become a specific concern during that time period. And they are still actually until now, but that specific time was a little bit attracting more attention. So in a sense, Australian migration zone, as you can see on this map here, was one of the way the Australian government then tried to address the concern of border protection and trying to prevent people from coming to Australia and making anybody who tried to join this territory a criminal and taking them to even detention. Then in the 2010s, we saw operations of sovereign border protections, again, somehow tightening the measures around asylum seeking people. Offshore processing recommenced again in 2012 with strategic depth as boats carrying asylum seekers capitalized. The image is again just to illustrate how border protection became again a very big focus in these years, and that came to be one of the way government tried to prevent people from coming to the country. So yeah, and then came the latest years. We know all about the 2020s, which is actually referred to as Fortress Australia, when we, not only Australia, but other countries, all countries adopted strict migration measures, strict policies around immigration and closing all the borders. And this in particular had affected refugees and asylum-seeking people in many ways. Not only the restrictions from coming to the country, but even the media discourse, the narratives. You see, for example, Donald Trump, who's also known for adopting racist rhetorics during this period, in particular, referring to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus. And you can remember how Chinese in particular and all Asian people in general were kind of stigmatized, not only in America, but how even the policies which were adopted in many countries were again so much reflecting these dynamics and racism being again at the heart of some of them. So clearly we can see how race has shaped the policies in the immigration sector. We might want to speak more about other factors such as gender. And this will become very important as we start speaking about refugee and protection visa pathways, because there are specific visas which are known, for example, as targeting specific genders. We have what is known, for example, as the Women's at Risk visa, which aims to help women who don't have any male protective figures and who are at risk of harm wherever they live. Those kinds of visa help those people to move to Australia. But we also have other visa pathways targeting LGBTQ people who are at risk of persecution because of their sexual orientation. So clearly, gender is another aspect we shall be looking at. We might also look at how age gets to be another factor. There are visas you can't apply for after a certain age. Most skilled migration visa, you'll see that one of the criteria is around age 45 or 35. Well, I can't remember, but technically you see how these factors get actually to define who can come and stay in Australia. Thank you very much. In the next recording, we shall be looking at the key debates and challenges to refugee integration.